Title, please.
He was in the car. Does that make him a killer?
At 2:42 a.m. on January 15th, 2020, a black BMW idled on a quiet street in South Auckland. Two older men stepped out of the vehicle. They walked up to a nearby house, fired a single fatal shotgun blast through a window, killing 57-year-old Mrs. Meliame Fisi'ihoi, and hurried back to the car. But there was a third person present. 18-year-old Manu Iongi had been sitting in the front passenger seat the entire time. He never opened his door, and he never set foot on the property. Yet, following the investigation, all three men in the vehicle were charged with homicide offenses. The two shooters were convicted of murder, and Manu, the passenger, was convicted of manslaughter. This raises a difficult question about the physical boundaries of a crime. If you're sitting in a car while a shooting happens 20 feet away, does your presence alone make you a killer in the eyes of the law? To secure that conviction, prosecutors relied on Section 66 of the Crimes Act, an area of law known as joint enterprise or party liability. It states that if you form a common intention to carry out an illegal act and assist others in doing so, you are equally responsible. In practice, joint enterprise has a notorious history of sweeping up young gang associates. It allows the state to incarcerate peripheral bystanders for the extreme violence committed by the principal offenders. Manu Iongi appealed his manslaughter conviction all the way to the Supreme Court of New Zealand, arguing that the jury got it wrong. His appeal forced the legal system to confront a dangerous gray area. If the courts accept that riding in a car is enough to prove you joined a murderous plan, the boundary between being in the wrong place at the wrong time and being a legally liable participant effectively disappears. The Crown's case against Manu was built almost entirely on spatial proximity. They pointed to the 14 minutes he spent inside the BMW as it drove toward the crime scene. Inside that car were three members of the Crips street gang, and sitting somewhere in the cabin was a loaded, warm shotgun. Furthermore, evidence showed that the day after the shooting, Manu was the one who went back to retrieve the hidden murder weapon from another cousin's house. The prosecution presented a simple logical deduction. Gang members executing a late-night hit do not bring along an uninformed, non-participating passenger. Relying exclusively on these circumstantial details, the Crown inferred that Manu must have been fully aware of the plan, acting as backup muscle and a willing participant in the joint enterprise. The defense countered by pointing to what was missing. Manu was much younger than the shooters, and unlike his cousins, he had absolutely no history of violence or animosity toward the victim's family. He never physically moved from his seat during the attack. The police found no digital communications, no text messages, and no audio recordings proving he knew about the shotgun or the planned confrontation before he got into the car. Because the Crown lacked this direct evidence, the defense established an equally valid legal inference. Manu was simply a passive bystander, unexpectedly caught in an escalating situation engineered by his older relatives. The Supreme Court reviewed the timeline and identified what is known as an epistemic gap. We know the car was driving, but there is zero direct evidence of what was actually said or agreed upon inside the cabin. Section 66 requires the Crown to prove intentional assistance beyond a reasonable doubt. If circumstantial evidence leaves two opposing scenarios equally plausible, a jury cannot legally guess. When faced with competing inferences, the scale must tip to default to innocence. Because the jury had to guess what was in Manu's mind, the Supreme Court determined the manslaughter conviction was based on unreasonable speculation rather than factual proof. The Supreme Court allowed the appeal, officially quashing the manslaughter conviction and entering a total judgment of acquittal. Manu Iongi walked free. Meanwhile, the older cousins, who actually stepped out of the vehicle and pulled the trigger, remain convicted murderers. This ruling acts as a definitive legal handbrake. It strictly limits the state's ability to use the joint enterprise doctrine to convert physical proximity into a homicide charge. Cases like this often generate intense political friction, pitting public safety advocates who want to dismantle gang operations against a judiciary fiercely protective of individual liberties. But the legal system ultimately prioritizes individualized justice. The Supreme Court explicitly affirmed that guilt by association has no proper place in the law, rejecting any framework that looks like collective punishment. The enduring threshold established here is clear. You must be judged by your own actions, because physical presence in a vehicle does not legally equate to participation in.
January 15, 2020, Māngere night turned cold. 57